Hi everyone, welcome to Erupt. I'm so excited to be having this session today. I'm just waiting for our great guest to join us. So thanks if you're gonna tune in. Excited to get this started. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is my first live, so I'm excited to see where this will take us. My whole Erupt squad is here right now. Hey everyone. So we're going to be talking about the ever-looming mandates that are in place really because of COVID. So we're going to be getting a legal expert's opinion. So I'm going to bring them in. And just make sure. Hi,
Hey, Lauren.
I'm Lauren LaBruna. You are Jonathan LaCour. Thanks so much for being here today.
No problem.
So let's get started talking all things. Oh, there you go. Vaccine, mask, mandates. You are a labor and employment attorney. So
Right.
you've probably seen a lot of this. But before we really get into the mandates specifically and legal grounds and all that good stuff, can you start by just telling us about your background as an attorney and really how you've seen the scope of your work change, if at all, in the last year and a half?
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Jonathan LaCour. I'm the founder of Employees First Labor Law. We are a labor and employment law firm in the LA area. And yeah, my sole focus is pretty much labor and employment law. And we've been doing this for quite a long time. Over the past year, we've had a lot of people contacting us related to COVID-related issues. Employers not following CDC guidelines, people feeling unsafe at work, people actually getting sick at work, people in doctors' offices, that feel that their doctors' offices are not complying with the law. So, we've kind of seen it all over the past 6 months or so. We've seen a lot more people talk about the mandate, the vaccine mandate, whether your employer can require it, whether you can be fired if your employer requires it and you don't take the vaccine. And so it's a whole new area of law that is emerging right now. There isn't too much in terms of court rulings, but we're navigating it as we go along.
Right, a lot on your plate, a lot that you're handling. You bring up an interesting point, which I'm sure we'll get into later, about people actually consulting you about maybe people not following the mandates or the requirements, which I think is obviously an issue as well, and people who are having concerns about the mandates themselves. But before we even get into the vaccine mandate, because I know that's really what people are talking about now, in the really early stages when COVID, everyone was just trying to protect themselves, masks were being required in most places. I know it kind of depends on where you live, where that enforcement level was at, but did you ever have people concerned about masks specifically, or is it more kind of like what you talked about, people concerned about others not wearing a mask in the workplace?
Both. I actually do have a case right now where, we're split. We're split as a community, as a society, as to whether or not to wear masks and whether your individual freedoms and your ability to, not take the vaccine or not wear the mask should trump others' ability to not to stay safe, I guess. We've seen a lot of people, and I actually have a case right now at a doctor's office where the people working there were not wearing masks and they were not being safe. They were going to events, large events, and doing things that would typically expose them to lots of other people. In that one particular case that I'm referencing, at a doctor's office, mind you, she was required to sit very close to somebody who was going to church proceedings and group gatherings, and that person contracted COVID. She made complaints, and my client actually contracted COVID as well. And then ultimately, she requested to go get tested, and they fired her for wanting to go get tested on the clock. So you see a broad spectrum of types of claims. That claim that I just referenced is something that would be a typical viable claim. Things are changing now with the government, requiring their employees to get the vaccine, and with the Pfizer FDA approval for the Pfizer vaccine. But yeah, the typical case for something like that is somebody who made complaints of companies failing to abide by CDC guidelines or local or state or federal laws, and then are ultimately being terminated for that. That's the typical type of case there.
And just out of curiosity, what, I know maybe you can't speak on one case specifically, but what is the sort of legal recourse there? Is there a way where, as some individuals that's put in a situation that's feeling unsafe, obviously unfortunately, this individual ended up contracting COVID because of the situation. Are there ways where you can kind of tell your employer now, hey, I feel uncomfortable being in this environment, especially as we're seeing people return to work. I don't really want to be at work right now. Right. I may be vaccinated, but obviously COVID can still spread between people. Is there any sort of leg for people to stand on to say, hey, I don't want to be in this environment right now. I'll do my job from home or whatever it may be?
Yes. So the typical type of claim that we would see there is a whistleblower claim. A whistleblower claim is where an individual makes a complaint of what they reasonably believe to be illegal activity or an order or directive that could be illegal. And if you make that complaint and you're retaliated against for that, then you have a whistleblower claim. So typically in these types of scenarios, we'll see somebody complain and say, I saw in the comments, are CDC guidelines laws? Well, it doesn't exactly have to be a law. You just have to have a reasonable belief that that is the law. And I think the layperson, most people out there, could think that the CDC guidelines is an agency, it's part of a government. It helps control the diseases for society, that mandate could be a law. And so if you make a complaint of what you reasonably believe to be the law, and your employer then terminates you for that, then that could be a whistleblower action. Now, if you contract COVID, let's say that your employer is exposing you to COVID, okay, and then you get sick. We unfortunately had a situation last year at a very large hospital where a business analyst was working for a large hospital and was in direct contact with nurses that had their full gowns on, but were also in direct contact with those who had COVID. And it was unsafe. It really was unsafe because then they would, wearing the same clothing, the same garbs, they would go and talk to the business analysts that in the same clothing that they were talking to people who had COVID. And so our client, unfortunately, did contract COVID. He did pass away, a young man. In that circumstance, his family was entitled to workers' compensation benefits for that. Okay, so if you do contract COVID, last year the governor passed an executive order that essentially says that there's a presumption that it's related to work. So you would have, if you are or part of the front line and you were directly exposed to it, you'd have the presumption that you should get care based off of your workers' compensation. So that's another way that we do see it. The vast majority of them, I have to be honest with you, there's a lot of people calling and saying, my employer's now mandating the vaccine. It is required. And if I don't get it, I'm going to have to be tested weekly. Or in some cases, if I don't get the vaccine, I'm going to be fired. Yeah, that seems to be the hot topic.
Right. So we're moving right into what pretty much everyone's talking about. Vaccine mandates are being implemented for a lot of different industries. To name a few companies, Delta Airlines, Amtrak, Google, Lyft, Walgreens. But as you did bring up, some people have the option that if they don't get vaccinated, they have to undergo the weekly testing. Some could be twice a week, some could be once a week. But what are you hearing from clients that are challenging these vaccine mandates, and what are the reasons why they want to challenge them?
I would say the calls started probably about 4 to 5 months ago, okay, where employers were starting to trickle in, pushing their employees to get the vaccine so that they might be able to relax some of the CDC guidelines. They might be able to take off the mask in the workplace. They might be able to work in closer proximity than they otherwise would. That's how it started, okay? But there was 2 main pushes here. The first was when local and state governments started indicating to their employees, hey, you guys have got to get the vaccine, and if you don't, you're gonna have to do testing on a weekly basis. Once that happened, boom, everybody started to follow suit, because what they're saying is, at least internally with the groups that are running these organizations, if the government's doing it, we're likely not going to get sued for doing what the government does.
Right.
So once that happened, everybody basically flipped a switch, and it was immediately overnight. We started to get a flood of calls, and people saying, my employer is now mandating the vaccine. I don't feel comfortable. It's against my religion. I have medical restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. What do we need to do to request that, I get an exemption? And we'll talk about that. Okay. But the second thing there that I think started to drive a lot more companies forcing the vaccine was the FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine. Once that happened, I would say most companies between 40, 50 plus employees and up that hadn't already jumped on the bandwagon then did it. Because a lot of the arguments people were making prior to that were, I don't feel safe injecting myself with something that didn't stand the tests and rigors of FDA approval. It hasn't yet gotten approval. It's an experimental vaccine. I don't know what I'm putting in my body. That was a lot of the argument. Suddenly,
Has that faded a lot? Because now,
yeah.
Pfizer just recently happened. So have you seen less because of that? Because now it's been approved by the FDA?
No, we've seen an increase of people calling, trying to not get the vaccine. But, the conversation that I have with people is a little bit more bleak than it was before. Okay, there were fewer options because a lot of people before would say, it's still experimental. It's still something that we don't exactly know the full ramifications, the 12-month, 18-month study. I don't know what the vaccine's going to do to me in 24 months. And so once that happened, and it got FDA approval, another wave of them started coming because employers at that point, again, it was just like before when the government started to do that to its own employees. Again, there was a flood of companies, organizations now saying you have to get the vaccine. It's now approved. And if you don't get the vaccine, there's two ways here. You can either be tested on a weekly basis or you can be fired. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of people stand their ground, stay on their principles, and unfortunately get fired. And we've had to tell them, unfortunately, we can't take the case.
Right. So that's what I was going to ask you. You're the legal expert. You know so much about this. So when it comes to, I want to kind of tie in exemptions that you brought up as well. People's like their religion or whatever it may be, may have an allergy to whatever is in the vaccine. Is that the reality that it's like there is really not much we can do here, especially because of all the recent events of the FDA approval, and now the government is looking to mandate it for their own workers. So if you don't actually have a legitimate exception, is it just, okay, well, that's what the private business or company, whatever it is, has the right to tell you to get vaccinated?
Yeah, people are really familiar with those two exemptions. It's the religious exemption and the medical exemption. Okay, I had the pleasure of prosecuting these cases prior to COVID. Okay, back then, prior to COVID, they were the flu vaccine. And people know those exemptions, but they don't realize how difficult they can be to actually secure them. And if your employer doesn't grant them when they should, how difficult it is to enforce the law for that. It becomes extraordinarily difficult. And I have to talk a little bit about arbitration agreements because there's interplay here. Okay, if your employer is requiring the vaccine, you request an exemption based on a religious belief of not being able to put harmful or foreign substances in your body, okay, which we've seen with people who are claiming New Order Islam, okay, and some other religions, or some type of medical allergy. I've had people call because they had, asthma, they've had, all types of allergic reactions, they got a shot of erythromycin one time and their lips blew up. It's difficult to actually secure those exemptions in real life. I won't say which hospital, but there was a hospital prior to COVID that mandated the flu vaccine, and the only exemptions were the medical and religious. And we ended up doing discovery in the case, and we found that I think it was something like 38 individuals had requested that religious exemption. 0 of them got that exemption, 0. And in arbitration, you have a situation where there's a private judge that is paid handsomely. Okay, and most people don't know or understand that, but they're paid handsomely by the defendants and their insurance providers. And this is something that most people don't know when they're entering into arbitration agreements. But the honest truth is, it becomes exceedingly difficult to enforce the law in arbitration because these arbitrators, these mediators, are being paid $10,000, $12,000, $17,000 per day. Per day.
Wow.
And they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. I'm not saying the whole entire process is corrupt, but you see what difficulty somebody who's trying to enforce the law, who may have been wrongfully terminated, is facing. Because if an arbitrator is being paid an enormous amount of money, it can be difficult to face that type of financial pressure. Okay? So in terms of arbitration, if you have an arbitration agreement, get out of it as best as you can, or leave your employer, or if they're asking you to sign one, don't sign it. Do the best that you can to not. Okay? Even without an arbitration agreement, it is very difficult for you to secure a religious or medical exemption. Okay? There are 2 points, and I'll stop with this, and I'll let you continue with the questions. My apologies for taking over.
No, it's great.
There's 2 points for religious exemptions that make it exceedingly difficult. Okay, that I've faced in my cases prior to COVID. The first was to get or establish a claim for a religious exemption, you need to point to the religious text where it shows that you cannot take the vaccine. Where can you do that? Which Bible, Quran, religious text is going to have direct language indicating that you can't take a vaccine? It doesn't exist. Right. Now, the other option would be to secure a statement from a top religious cleric. Where can you get that?
Interesting.
It becomes exceedingly difficult to prove the validity of a religious exemption. And so while most people know the religious and medical exemptions, it becomes increasingly difficult. The medical exemptions, I've had people, like I said, come to us for allergies, come to us for asthma, come to us for various issues. Unless you have a real autoimmune disease that places you at risk, it's going to be very difficult for you to secure that. I just have to be honest with you. And even if you did have that, the likelihood of your employer granting you that exemption and not facing consequences is still low, because your employer is not, even if you do meet the criteria, is likely not going to want to meet or to give you that exemption. It just happens all the time.
Right. So there's so many levels at play here. And obviously it's not as easy maybe as people think it is to get an exemption. But I want to bring up a point. You said you started getting calls like 4 to 5 months ago about the vaccine mandate specifically. I feel like it seemed to be from a lot of people that the idea around vaccine mandates was kind of far away and we didn't really think people were going to mandate them. But obviously that's changed. I know you bring up FDA approval and the government actually implementing some sort of vaccine mandates. Is that what you think caused this change in more companies, to be like, okay, they did it, we're going to do it too?
100%, yes. A lot of companies were afraid of situations where, the government would find the other way, not mandating vaccines, not requiring people to, not permitting organizations to mandate the vaccine. Once that happened, it was essentially the blessing that private employers needed to be able to force that. And now it's become more of a societal issue. And employers are now taking that on to help push the societal agenda that they have, the more progressive agenda that they have. And I see a lot of that happening. The Delta, punitive mandate where you pay, a couple $100s a month if you remain unvaccinated. It's punitive. Yeah, right. It's punitive to those who are not getting the vaccine. So what they're doing there is they're creating a system within their organization that makes it punitive to not get the vaccine, to try to force or shift societal change. That's what they're trying to do.
I want you to elaborate, if you can, on sort of the societal change. I think I know what you mean, but I want you to explain to our audience, if you can, where we're starting to see this change where the vaccines are so widely accepted, and there may be more of a negative connotation if you decide not to get vaccinated. Can you explain how you've seen that change in your own clients? Has there been any change in your clients as well to be like, okay, I'm just going to have to go get it now?
Of course, yeah. Yes. So in terms of societal change, what I'm talking about is, that first major shift where the government finally said, our employees are going to have to get the vaccine. If not, you're going to submit to weekly testing. That kind of was the catalyst to start and to allow these private employers to basically say, you have to get the vaccine. If you don't get the vaccine, there's going to be negative consequences up to and including termination. Okay. Now, once that happened, a lot of private employers started to push those who were timid or not wanting to get the vaccine to get the vaccine. In terms of societal change, it did. It forced those people to get the vaccine, otherwise be fired. And a lot of people didn't want to be fired. We've had a lot of people who are, caretakers, they're nurses, even people in sales that go to visit others who didn't want to get the vaccine, that had their employer mandated, that then chose to get the vaccine. It did force that societal shift. And that's what I think is happening. Employers are taking that onus, taking that responsibility to try to push those who are unvaccinated to get vaccinated by making it financially difficult on them or granting them some type of benefit. And that's what we're seeing.
It seems to be working in a way. And I have to ask you, as a legal expert, what would it actually look like if someone tried to take this vaccine mandate to court against their employer?
Meaning, if they got the vaccine, or if they didn't get the vaccine, they would be fired and then fired.
Yeah, or is that
suing
even
for wrongful termination?
Right, is that even a reality?
No, unfortunately, that's not a case that we would be willing to take, because the difficulty that we had before COVID, the courts are essentially weighing the health and safety of the society versus the individual's rights to refrain from getting the vaccine. And what we've seen, at least in my cases, the cases that I had prior to COVID, is that judges, arbitrators are not very sympathetic to those who don't want to get the vaccine, where them contracting, COVID or them contracting the flu in an NICU could cause harm to others. Okay. And so your religious exemption, your medical exemption that isn't exactly as strong as you might otherwise need it to be, is not going to be enough for what the judge wants or what the judge is going to think the evidence is necessary to prove out those claims. Okay, to truly have a medical exemption, to truly have the religious exemption, it's very difficult. So, yeah, it can be extraordinarily difficult. Do I think it's causing societal change? I do, yeah.
And when you bring up the judges maybe lacking some sort of empathy for those because it could harm others, has it always been that way? Obviously, you've been in this field for a long time. Or is this sort of changed the way or changed the scope of the way judges look at this, especially when they're saying, if you're not going to get vaccinated, you have a higher chance of contracting COVID and giving it to your coworkers. What are your thoughts on that?
So the cases that I handled were pre-COVID. I can tell you, I do not know of a single employment lawyer today that is taking those cases where your employer mandates the vaccine, you don't get it, you are fired, and then you're suing for wrongful termination. I don't know of a single law firm that is taking those. I did the flu vaccine prior to COVID, where religious or medical exemption was not granted in those situations prior to COVID. I mean, right. COVID's a global pandemic, okay? It's unfortunately caused severe harm to the entire society, the global population. I think millions of people have probably died, if not hundreds of thousands. It's millions of people. And we're talking about that type of harm versus the flu, where a lot of people do pass away from the flu, but not at the level of, contracting and difficulty and the harm that people experience from COVID. Okay.
Right, not at the same scale. So it's obviously changed a lot there. And I want to ask you one of our last questions here, away from the workplace, but kind of similar in the same scope. A lot of universities have decided to mandate vaccines. Even my alma mater, USC, did as well. I know there's some people who are fighting against that. In one lawsuit, I don't know if you heard about it, I'm sure you did, in Indiana, 14 students filed a lawsuit against the school, or actually 8 students, citing the 14th Amendment, which includes personal autonomy and bodily integrity. But a judge struck down their suit. Again, they had the same options of either providing exemption, which again, from your legal expertise is not that easy, or to undergo the weekly testing. So is it the same sort of playing field when it comes to university students and college students sort of trying to fight back against the vaccine as it is in the workplace?
So they would be different types of claims. Okay, so if they're claiming 14th Amendment, that's different than what we would claim on public policy or, whistleblower type of claim. Okay, but I can tell you both types of claims are going to reach, an unmovable force. It's exceedingly difficult for anyone who is trying to shift the societal change from getting vaccines to not getting vaccines. There's just too much momentum for people who are getting vaccines for it to shift back to the individual's right. Okay, now what I think we're going to see, interesting enough, is vaccine mandates in high schools be contested and for younger students. And at what point are we going to say that our children, where the vaccine may not be recommended for, who are under the age of 14, 12, whatever it may be, at what point do we mandate them to get vaccines, or to what extent are they regulated in elementary school? I think that's something that's going to be tested, and I don't know where that will shake out. But in terms of colleges, university students, you're going to have a difficult time with claims like that. You just will. Each state is different. Indiana is a much more traditionally conservative state. And so if you're facing that difficulty there, and California is a traditionally blue state, what do you think would happen here in California? It would be rubber stamped, right? So we're operating with the series of facts that California is a traditionally blue state. Traditionally blue states are going to favor the vaccine. You're finding situations where traditionally red states are finding in favor of the vaccine. It's just not going to end up well for anybody that's contesting, unfortunately, getting a vaccine or a vaccine mandate.
And my last question for you, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, but when people are having these questions and we're all navigating this kind of together at the same time, understanding the mandates, kind of new protocol in the workplace, what is the best way to go about really understanding what may be legal, what may not be legal? Maybe that means going to you. I don't know, any sort of resources or advice you could share?
I'm happy to answer any questions. There is guidance on the EEOC's website. Okay, there's also guidance on the DFEH website, I believe. So you can go to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, or the federal version of the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, the EEOC, and you can look it up and you can see, whether an employer can mandate the vaccine, to what extent, there can be restrictions on people who don't get the vaccine. If they don't, whether or not you're permitted to be separated from the group, terminated. There's guidance there, and the EEOC and the DFEH are traditionally there for the workers. They're there to help the employees, the people that can't get legal representation for whatever reason. And so if they're providing guidance that essentially says you have to get the vaccine, or as an employer you can separate people, that's problematic for the people that don't want to get the vaccine, unfortunately. Also, you can contact us anytime, and I'm happy to hop on a phone call and chat and explain the state of the law for you.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on Erupt today to share your legal expertise. Thank you for sharing that with us, and I hope to have you back again soon.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.